The Luminous Mind, episode 16.
When you and your kid look back at, your kid's childhood, he's not going to remember that you were fighting over, how he writes that paper or what time he was doing it or the math assignment that he was refusing to do. What he's going to remember, or she, they're going to remember is how it felt being a kid growing up in your family.
Benjamin Franklin once said, "Do not curse the darkness, rather light a candle instead." If you're ready to set your mind on fire, then prepare yourself for the Luminous Mind with your host, Rebecca Bowman.
Eric Tivers is the owner of Tivers Clinical Specialists, a private practice located in northern Illinois. Eric specializes in ADHD and high-functioning autism. As a psychotherapist, he works with children, teens, parents, and adults. He coaches teens and adults and consults to schools. He is a national speaker and host of ADHD Rewired podcast. He also has ADHD. Eric's clinical experiences include clinical program manager and residential treatment and counselor at a therapeutic day school, behavioral consultant, ABA, and music therapist for children with autism. Eric earned his MSSW at the Jane Addams College of Social Work at the University of Illinois at Chicago and his BSW at Bradley University. Okay, well, welcome, Eric. I've kind of introduced you to our audience, but I would like you to just kind of briefly explain maybe some personal stuff about yourself and then what your business is about.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me on. And so a little bit about myself and about my business. So I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I am a coach, and my focus is ADHD and autism spectrum disorders. So I work in private practice. I work for myself. I consider myself an entrepreneur. I'm a podcaster. I have the podcast ADHD Rewired. I'm married. I have a 3-year-old who both has some pretty profound giftedness and is also on the autism spectrum. And so that's a unique kind of paradox, or not irony, because I've been working with autism for probably about 8 or 9 years now. I am a musician.
Oh, wow. What instrument do you play? Just curious.
I started kind of teaching myself piano when I was like 4. And my mom had me take lessons, but I never actually was paying attention during the lessons, but I had a really good ear for it. So I would kind of fake being able to read the music, but I was always playing. And so my influence growing up was Nintendo, because what would actually happen, because have we mentioned yet that I have ADHD? So what would happen is that I would get bored playing Nintendo, so I would go over to the piano, which was near the TV, and I would sound out the theme songs to the video games. So,
wow.
Mario Brothers and, Zelda, and I would just figure them out by listening to them. And I thought for some time in my life that I would be a professional musician, but then I realized how much executive functioning and planning and organizing and is actually involved in that. So I ended up going to grad school and doing that. But I do have a piano and a keyboard and a guitar in my office. I also play guitar. I taught myself that as well, but I've been playing piano for basically as long as I could reach the keys.
Oh, that's cool. All right, so I have to give our audience a little bit of background. I was really excited to get Eric on here because I listened to another podcast that I love, EO Fire, so obviously we have a connection there. And he was talking about autism and ADHD and ADD, and I know that a lot of homeschoolers will bring their kids home when they feel like there's a problem with that. And he has a very unique personal story of how he diagnosed himself. Do you want to tell us about that?
Sure. Well, it wasn't that I fully diagnosed myself. So when I was in college, my freshman year of college, I was studying communications, and let me put air quotes around studying. So my freshman year, I went away to college, and I got a 2.2 my first semester,
oh, wow.
Which was not very good. And then there was a threat of if I don't get my grades up, I was going to be pulled out of school by my parents. And if I was my parents, I probably would have done the same thing. So I opened up the books my second semester and I got a 1.8.
Oh my gosh.
So the moral of this story is, kids, it doesn't end here. Don't worry. Okay. So I did worse. I got a 1.8, finished my freshman year with a 2.0 GPA. And so now I had lost some grant money, and I think I was on probation. And, somehow I convinced my parents to give me one more chance. And they did. So I went back to school, and it was, I think, a week or so before classes actually started. And I was having dinner with a friend, and she was actually sharing with me that over the summer she was diagnosed with ADHD. And what she described to me was the first time I actually ever heard in words what kind of my life experience was like, at least from the perspective of what it's like to be inside my own brain. The things, so she had ADHD, and what she described to me, things like, how she was always inconsistent with what she was doing. When, one of the big things was for reading for her, she would read and be reading and then realize that she had no idea what she read. And that's how it always was for me. Because for me, I would start reading something and then it would trigger a thought, and that thought would trigger another thought. And I would be continuing to read, not realizing that I'm not processing anything that I'm reading, because I'm having 100 thoughts a minute. So, but then I wouldn't go back and read it because it was boring. And and that's the thing with ADHD, is that when you're interested in something, so you really can become an expert in something when you're interested. But when something is boring, I view having to do tedious, boring things for the person with ADHD is sort of like asking a person in a wheelchair to climb some stairs.
Yeah, I have that. That was one of the reasons why I wanted you on here as well, is that what you were saying in this other podcast, it was like a light bulb hit for me, because I have a son that I swear you were describing him to a T in a lot of different areas. So what are some of the ADHD, ADD, what are some of the indications with that parents can recognize?
Sure. And I do want to add to you that I did get an evaluation and did confirm the diagnosis.
You didn't just go ahead.
No, because, a lot of people do, just say they self-diagnose themselves. And so, it's because the reason it's important to really get that evaluation from someone who actually knows what they're doing is because, depression has symptoms of ADHD. PTSD has symptoms of ADHD. Sleep disorders have symptoms of ADHD. So it's really important that you work with a trained expert that really understands ADHD. Unfortunately, there's a definite shortage of people who really understand ADHD. So hopefully, things like this interview, my podcast, and there's a growing awareness of it, but we're still really kind of fighting an uphill battle to educate the public on what ADHD really is.
Yes.
And now,
it was eye-opening to me, because I've always held some weird opinions about it too, but I loved what you were saying about it. So tell us, what are some of the indications then? Sure.
So, from a behavioral level, it's knowing what you're supposed to do, but not doing what you know. I look at it as the disorder of good intentions. It can, if you ever have those kind of really good ideas, but then you seem to, never follow through on them. These are kind of common traits that we see. One other feature of it is kind of described as having a faulty on-off switch, and that has to do with kind of behavioral activation. So it can be just as hard to start something, but once you're fully engaged in that thing, it can be just as hard to stop that thing. And one of the things that's really, I think, confusing for a lot of people about ADHD is that one of the hallmarks of it is that it is consistently inconsistent. So just because you're able to do something today doesn't mean you're able to do it tomorrow. Because ADHD it's a disorder of it's called the executive functions of the brain. Because ADHD neurologically, it's a developmental neurological disorder, basically of the brain's internal control and command center. So the things that kind of control time awareness, that control motivation, different aspects of our memory, even our mental kind of flexibility and our ability to adapt if something, if there's a change in plans. Also, our ability to inhibit distraction and that inhibitory control, which, helps us, not do things, so it gives us that pause, that split second. It says, is this a good idea? And what are the consequences for this? So, that's kind of how it affects us neurologically. And ADHD is a developmental delay of an area of the brain that develops last, called the prefrontal cortex. And, so it's really important to understand that. So your 10-year-old, when it comes to the areas of the brain that are indicated in ADHD, is really like 7. The 15-year-old is really like 12. So we're looking at on average about a 3-year delay. And then when we're looking at adults, because we don't typically grow out of this, because it is a developmental delay, we do improve because our brain's continuing to develop. It's just always a little bit behind. So, that's kind of the big picture, sort of nutshell version of what ADHD is. But there's 18 symptoms in ADHD, and I'm not going to go through all of them because I think your listeners will be like, so. But it's important to understand, one thing that most people that are really new to the topic of ADHD don't realize, and this is confusing about the name, is that, so ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. And one of the issues is that you can have ADHD without the H. So you don't actually need to have that hyperactivity piece to have ADHD. And and it's called inattentive presentation of ADHD. And so what that looks like is you're a spacey, disorganized kid or adult, bad at time management, bad issues with memory. So understanding that inattentive piece for a lot of people explains, a lot, because it's not this laziness. In fact, I look at the word lazy as a 4-letter word. If someone calls me lazy, if someone calls me lazy, I say those are fighting words. And here's why. People with ADHD are often accused of being lazy because from an observational perspective, it does look like it. But what we actually know from neuroscience, from doing brain scans of individuals with ADHD, is that the ADHD brain is actually working much harder and is having to use areas of the brain that we shouldn't need to have to use in order to do kind of mundane cognitive tasks.
Yeah.
So when we look at these brain scans, and if I were to show you a picture of these brain scans, and if I said to you, okay, more color means a more engaged, harder working brain, less color means the brain's not doing that much, which brain is working harder, you're going to point to the brain that's lighting up. And that's the ADHD brain doing a basic kind of cognitive task, something that's mundane and boring.
Well, that's interesting. When I was listening to what you were saying, like I said, I feel like my son may have ADHD, but he's extremely bright. But like you said, I have a hard time, if he is into it, he will go full throttle, and sometimes I have to try to pull him off of it.
Yep.
But then, like you said, I've with his schooling, I've almost if he's not gonna do it, I'm not gonna push him because I can't get him to do something that he doesn't want to do. And I don't necessarily consider him lazy just because I've seen that where he can have a passion of something and really go for that. So I don't know. Maybe that's not an
we look at that as what that's actually called as hyperfocus. And, a better name for ADHD would probably be something like attention regulation or attention modulation disorder, because it's when you're interested in something, it's, as you said, full throttle, full attention, complete engagement in that thing.
Yeah.
But when you're not, it's really hard to get the brain activated to pay attention to stuff.
Yeah.
So, some of the features of that can look like it's, if your kid seems like they're not paying attention to you, if they, if they are put up a lot of energy to avoid certain tasks, they often lose things.
Yeah.
I mean, it's funny. I work with kids with ADHD. I work with kids and adults, but when I'm working with kids, and one of the most common challenges is the homework struggle. So what I like to do is I like to make things very visual and concrete. So I say, okay, how long does homework typically take you on a given night? Okay, so let's say they say it takes 2 hours. Say, okay, so the homework takes 2 hours, and I'll get either Legos or different color blocks, and we kind of section them off, and each block is worth like 15 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So if they start their homework at, say, and your listeners are homeschoolers, so I guess it doesn't really matter what time they start it. So let's say that
they could be doing homework all day, though. So
you guys are on your own schedule. So so let's say you're working from 12 to 2. Okay, that's your scheduled time to work. So, and you have, say, 3 things you need to accomplish during that time. Now, if from 12 to 2, you're spending 50% of that time complaining about it, whining about it, arguing over it, avoiding it, you're actually still spending time on homework, but you're just not getting any of it done. So I tell kids, I say, look, like here, you can choose to continue to spend that hour that way, or you can take this hour, and I hand them the block that represents this amount of time, and do whatever you want. But you have to trade in the complaining time. Because if you eliminated that part of it, you're going to have more free time. So it's you're spending all this time on homework, but when we look at how much time you actually spending engaged in task-oriented behaviors, it's often a lot less than they think. So when you break it up that way, it's like, oh, so I can cut my homework time in half, sometimes even more than that. I mean, I work with kids where 5 minutes of on-task behavior takes them 3 hours to do.
Wow. That's crazy. I have experience with that. So, you talked about getting a good diagnosis. You hear a lot about ADHD and ADD in the news now. And I hear people say all the time that they feel like it's being misdiagnosed, that the schools are just using that reason to drug our kids so that they, are comatose in the classroom. What do you feel about that? And do you feel like it's misdiagnosed?
Is it misdiagnosed? I mean, sure, but so are cancers.
Overdiagnosed?
Is it overdiagnosed? We love to think in binary terms of yes and no. Are there cases where it is overdiagnosed? We can see statistically that there are certain cases. We don't know quite why. There's an interesting study that looks at regional prevalence of the diagnosis. Okay, now internationally and even just in the States, it's the average is anywhere between 3 to 9%, probably about 5 to 7% is most accurate. So, but there are areas that there are higher rates of diagnosis. So in those specific kind of smaller regional areas, maybe there are, but there's also even on the other end of the scale, there are more people who are not getting diagnosed who should be. One of the things that's really interesting, and I want your listeners to really hear this, 85% of people walking around right now who have ADHD don't know it. And I'm not saying that 85% of people have ADHD and don't know it. I'm saying 85% of people who actually have ADHD are not aware that they have it. And a lot of those people end up in jail, prison, drug addicted, early pregnancy, or worse.
Yeah.
Because some of the more severe ends of ADHD, engages in a lot of high risk behaviors. And
you said that they don't sometimes can't make very good decisions because there's a block there. Is that true?
Part of ADHD is our brain is on both sides of the issue of reinforcement and consequence. We're kind of doubly impaired. So we need a lot of reinforcement, and especially on the positive reinforcement to maintain behaviors. But we're also really slow for that to actually be effective. So we don't learn from those consequences, unfortunately, as quickly as we would like, as quickly as parents would like. So we are less sensitive to those, in a sense, the reinforcements or the consequences. However, we also need them even more. So it's so when we look at rewards and consequences as something that our brain processes on a neurological level, our brain has some impairment in that area.
So if you have a child who's misbehaving a lot and you're always reprimanding them, you need to keep that in mind, and then also try a more positive parenting. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes, absolutely.
Until there's at least a diagnosis made.
Yes. I had a grad school professor that was talking. He worked in both education and in mental health, and he was sharing with us for kids with ADHD, that they on average get 17 kind of what we call just redirections. So basically attention for unwanted behaviors for every one positive reinforcement. Okay. Now, so hold that number in mind for a moment. When we think about the emotional impact of that, think about kind of this emotional bucket. Every time you give a kid with ADHD some positive feedback or praise, you get to fill in kind of one unit of something for that fills up that bucket. Okay. Every time that you criticize, redirect, shame that kid with ADHD, you just lost 17 in that emotional bucket.
Wow.
So we wonder why kids with ADHD have so many comorbid, coexisting mental health issues like anxiety and depression. One of the best ways to create what we call clinically oppositional defiant disorder, which is, it's kind of like this neurological, it's kind of like a knee-jerk reaction, okay? So if you say black, I'm going to say white. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So the ADHD brain is an understimulated, under-aroused brain in its natural resting state. Guess what arguing does to the ADHD brain?
What?
Stimulates it.
So that's probably that explains a lot too. My son just seems like he just loves to argue.
And so now emotionally, I would say probably not, but his brain, there's a difference between our mind.
He does feed on it, and he likes debate. He really likes.
Our minds are brilliant. Our brain is dumb. Okay, our brain is just a mass of tissue and electrical connections that's really complicated. But the brain, it likes the feedback. It likes the stimulation. It's not connecting. Oh, this is actually making life a lot harder for me and everyone around me. Because as mammals are dopamine seeking creatures, and dopamine is a neurotransmitter that is responsible for kind of our pleasure. Mm-hmm. Okay. So when we're under aroused, our brain feels unregulated. It feels not well. So it will do things to modulate, to regulate kind of keep the balance of what it needs. And, it learns very quickly that, when I argue, my brain kind of wakes up and now I can pay attention. So if you have a kid who's an arguer, it's not that he likes making your life miserable. It's that his brain likes the stimulation.
That's an interesting concept. Before we go on, let's take a minute to thank our sponsors.
Hey, Firestarters, this is Mark, producer of The Luminous Mind. If you're like me, the thought of going out to the store and shopping is enough to make you want to crawl in a hole and hide. If that's you, then do your shopping online through Amazon. Just go to theluminousmind.net, click on the Amazon link, and shop away. Also, most of the books and resources that Rebecca and her guests discuss can be found on our Amazon links as well. Again, if you're like me, you have already accidentally signed up for Amazon Prime. So most of those purchases should have free shipping as well. Good luck!
Welcome back to The Luminous Mind with Eric Tivers. So after we get our children diagnosed, how do you recommend treating ADHD and ADD?
Well, it all kind of depends on how old you are and how much impairment there is. So in the treatment of ADHD, we use what's called multimodal treatment. So that includes medication, that includes behavioral management, environmental modification, education about ADHD, which is extraordinarily important. And cognitive behavioral therapy and coaching can all be part of that multimodal treatment. So I know that a lot of people, when it comes to medication, they're scared.
Yeah. That's exactly. Like I said, a lot of people feel like the public school system just wants to drug them up. And there's a lot of horrible stuff if you read on the internet about Ritalin and, a lot of those medications. What is your feeling on that?
Sure. Well, I prefer to not get my horrible stuff from Google. I prefer scientific journals. And here's why. Our brain is primed to respond to emotional stories, even in the face of clear black and white evidence. Okay? So we have to understand that natural human bias. Okay? Mm-hmm. I mean, in a lot of ways, that's very that's a great survival mechanism in a lot of way, except that it's not really
Healthy.
serving us. Right, right. So here's what the science says, and the science around ADHD is not new science. It goes back to, well, it's interesting as far as medication goes. So stimulant medication was first used and prescribed for ADHD in the 1930s by a psychiatrist named Dr. Bradley. And what was interesting about this, when he had his theory basically about the under-aroused brain, the other doctors and nurses that were on this, he's working in a psychiatric hospital on this boys unit, and all the other doctors and nurses were threatening to walk off the job, and because they thought this was the most crazy idea. Why would you give these hyperactive kids stimulant medication? Like he must be out of his mind. And to everyone's surprise, except I think his, they found kids that all of a sudden started to focus and were calmer and were able to organize themselves. And some of the literature from those initial kind of studies on this, they talked about how kids would actually refer to it within the first day as their math pill or their homework pill. So, but ADHD, here's the frustrating thing.
I have I don't mean to get you off track, but
Yeah.
Is it possible, because cold medicine, would put my other kids out, and it would actually, with my kid that I feel like has ADHD, it would actually cause him to go into this, almost crazed.
Sure.
It just sped up any emotions that he had. So anything
Sure.
that would be considered, it's basically opposite. Anything that may be a stimulant for somebody else.
Right. It's kind of paradoxical. So ADHD is actually one of the most researched disorders in all of psychiatry. Okay. There's an ongoing study. It's called the MTA study. It's the multimodal treatment study of ADHD. It's been going, I think we're on year 30. And when we're looking at longitudinal studies in this field, longitudinal studies often get called longitudinal after 6 months. We're talking 30 years now. And the studies and following, I think it's like 820 some people over multiple sites. So it's an extraordinarily well-designed study that, here's what it shows. That medication, when prescribed and used as directed by a doctor who understands how to prescribe it, is safe and it's effective. And 70 to 90% of people that try it have a positive treatment response to it. Now, that does not mean that all of these symptoms go away. And that does not mean that the first medication that you try is going to do the trick. The gold standard of treatment still is a statistical approach to trial and error. Now, a lot of people are going, I don't want trial and error. It's like, well, statistics, they're pretty powerful, okay? Confusing too. So it took me a couple of tries to get through my stats class in college. So, but I think when we think about how we come to these treatment kind of algorithms, it's not perfect, but it works pretty well. And so stimulant medication is the frontline treatment for ADHD. And, it works really well. The most common side effects are, and the ones that are tolerable, are initially issues with some sleep, dry mouth, appetite suppression.
My son doesn't sleep anyway. So,
well, and paradoxically, I have sleep issues, but paradoxically for some people, some prescribers will actually prescribe a very small dosage of a short, an immediate release stimulant to help stimulate the brain enough to get it to bed. I know it's so paradoxical, but for some people it works really well. So, I don't know if I mentioned, so I do take medication, and I started taking medication when I was diagnosed when I was in college. And, to tell your listeners that when I first took that medication, it's hard to imagine feeling normal for the first time in your life.
Well, and especially if you're being told all the time, you're not paying attention, you're not doing this or that. And
or if you're lazy, or if you only care. Yeah. And it was like this fog was removed from my brain. It was, there was life before that and there was life after that.
Wow. Well, and one of the things that I heard too is that children that are put on Ritalin or some of these medications that help ADHD, they're going to have a higher tendency to use drugs. But I guess what I've heard from what you said, they already do. I mean, the ADHD kids,
Great
ADHD.
question.
So, the fact that you put them on a mind-altering drug that's a stimulant isn't necessarily going to increase their desire to do illegal drugs, right? I mean, that may already be there.
Let me tell you exactly what the research says, okay?
Okay.
So people with ADHD have a higher probability of repeating a grade, dropping out of high school, teen pregnancy, having STDs, substance abuse, car accidents, serious car accidents, arrests, incarceration, being fired from a job. Okay, so they have all these higher rates, okay? On medication, they also still have higher rates from the typical population, but less when it's treated with medication.
That's interesting. Well,
okay.
That totally debunks what I've always thought. So thank you. So, we've talked about the medication, and we've talked about also being, our parenting style on how to interact with an ADHD child. Do you think that there's any natural treatments out there for parents?
Well, I think love is a good idea. Love your kid, give them hugs, know that, just go from the standpoint that they're not trying to make your life miserable, and that the things that they are doing, they are not doing intentionally. If you think your kid has ADHD, read about it, learn about it.
Yeah, education helps a lot.
There's a great organization called CHADD, CHADD.org, which where you can find that information. And they promote evidence-based information. It's a great organization. They have local support groups all over the country. But what I want to say about natural treatments is that dirt is natural. You know what else is natural? Cyanide is natural. It's a natural producing.
That's interesting to think of.
Cytosylin, that's natural. That'll make you hallucinate. So when we think of all natural, it's it's kind of like putting on this really comfy warm blanket. Like the only problem is that it's coated in like leaky lead and mercury, so it feels really good to be having these natural things, but it's that it doesn't mean a thing. There's no anything can be labeled all natural. It's marketing.
Yeah. Well,
okay?
I told you that my husband is a pharmaceutical rep, and he says every pharmaceutical drug is actually made from natural ingredients.
That's right.
So to say that it isn't natural, he doesn't believe that. He doesn't subscribe to that because it is a natural. I mean, it's not made from plastic. Well, and plastic is made from natural stuff too. So.
Right, and there are issues with vitamins and stuff that we get at the health food store because it's not regulated and there's no randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled studies. Medication, we know the risks of it. And here, if you have one person that has an adverse response to it, they have to write about it in the literature. Yeah. And if you have one person who has a adverse response to it and it gets written about in the New York Times, all of a sudden, stimulant medication is it's going to kill all these kids. It's like, yeah. Come on.
Well, and that is one thing, like with drug companies. I mean, we have a front seat to that, like I said, with my husband. And yeah, they do have to, in order to get it, on the counter and to be approved by the government, they actually have to go through all those hoops, and they spend millions upon billions of dollars doing that. And like you said, yeah, they have to list every single problem. They could only have one person that has that indication, right. And it may not even have to do anything with their drug.
Right. I was going to say that. Yes. That's so, when you're looking at stuff like ADHD and you're a parent, you kind of have to become an expert on something that you maybe never wanted to become an expert on.
Yeah. But it could help in the long run, right?
Right. But and here's the thing too, and this is what's really, I think, important for your listeners to know is that, in say 20 or 30 years from now, when you and your kid look back at, your kid's childhood, he's not going to remember that you were fighting over, how he writes that paper, or what time he was doing it, or the math assignment that he was refusing to do. What he's going to remember, or they're going to remember is how it felt being a kid growing up in your family.
Yeah, your reaction.
That relationship is so, so important.
Yeah.
Kids, I mean, here's the thing. We are wired to succeed. And if you don't believe that, watch a baby or a toddler or a newborn, or not newborn, a toddler learning to walk, because they fail over and over again and they keep trying. We're wired to do that.
Yeah.
If they're putting up that fight, there's a reason, and it's not because they're lazy.
That's great advice. So how do you recommend parents educating their children that have ADHD? I mean, we talked about, your reaction to them, but, if your child's always moving, I mentioned that my son used to like to, anytime he's learning something, he's got to be moving. That drives me crazy because it's distracting to me.
Well, it's funny because I'm the type of person that I have to be still to like learn and concentrate and keep a train of thought. But
is that a normal thing to have to move? I mean, maybe that's not an indication.
Yes, it is absolutely for some people that their body needs to be in motion for their brain to be kind of going. So, for people at homeschool, what a great opportunity to be able to, create a standing desk, create allow for that movement. Like if you can focus and you can get the work done and you're moving, super awesome.
One of the things that he loved to do is we would build words. I'd lay out the alphabet onto the floor and he could jump from letter to letter and build words.
Yeah.
And so something like that. Moving.
Yeah. And exercise is good for our brain.
Mm-hmm. It really
so
is.
Here's the thing. We talk about the natural approaches. Here's what I recommend for the natural approach. Intense, rigorous physical exercise.
That's interesting.
It's actually one of the best, non-medication forms of treatment for ADHD.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes I've wondered, kids used to grow up, boys especially, used to grow up doing all that heavy, hard farm labor stuff. And now that our society has moved less towards that, I kind of have wondered if that's been very detrimental to boys especially, but children with, ADHD, there isn't anything now to take out that physical, to really get that out of your system so that you can sit still and concentrate. What do you think about that?
I agree. I think, one of the things too is, for thinking about just adults, when we were more of an agricultural society, it was kind of clear what we needed to do when we needed to do it. There wasn't this ton of, multiple projects going on at the same time. Like we knew that what was ahead of us each day, and that's what we focused on. Now we have our lives are in a lot of ways just a lot more complicated. So I'm not saying that causes ADHD by any ways. I'm saying that the expectations of life are more demanding. And so for people with ADHD, that then becomes more of a challenge.
It's more frustrating for them. Before we say goodbye, though, give us some parting words of advice and then maybe how we can connect with you and learn more about ADHD and ADD.
You got it. So parting piece of advice is if you think that there is an attention-related issue, ADHD, or whatever you think the issue is, if something just seems to be going on funky with your kid, especially if you have more than one kid and their behaviors are completely different, investigate it, ask those questions. It's, ADHD is a good news diagnosis because it's so treatable and there's a lot of strengths that come along with it. So finding that area of interest, for homeschoolers, if you're a parent and you're pretty well structured, that could be great for a kid with ADHD because they can focus in their area of interest. So understand what ADHD really is, do the research, go to sites like CHAD, for accurate information. And then where they can reach me, you can find me at my website. I'll give you the website for my podcast, which all links to my website, and that's erictivers.com and ADHDrewired.com. So ADHD Rewired is my podcast. You can find it in iTunes, Stitcher, and all those places that podcasts are found.
Great.
And, it's just a lot of productivity tips. And the stories about what it's like to live with ADHD. The focus is mostly adults. So I'm also on Twitter at Eric Tivers. It's Eric with a C. And yeah, thanks for, so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Well, and looking at his website, I definitely encourage you to check it out because he has all sorts of therapy, coaching and consulting, and then a music therapy too, which I thought was awesome. So thank you so much for joining us, and it's just been a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind. To learn more about Eric Tivers, as well as how we treated our own ADHD child, go to our website, theluminousmind.net. When you're there, click on the Fire tab and be a fire starter yourself. Consider helping us grow by making your purchases through the Amazon widget on our website. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Google+. Get our audio content by subscribing on iTunes and YouTube. Light minds on fire and change the paradigm of education.